I couldn't believe it when I found out the HOA had foreclosed on my house, all over a measly $55 fine. I had no clue that my dad's tough-as-nails legal skills were about to completely shake up everything I thought I knew. Want to take a wild guess how I managed to turn this total disaster into the biggest win of my life? Hey there, welcome to the channel. If you enjoy wild Tamara stories or HOA horror tales, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Honestly, I never would have guessed that a tiny little fine, just $55, could completely flip my world on its head. It all started one sunny morning. I strolled out to grab the mail like I always do, not expecting anything crazy. But there it was, a letter that made my heart drop into my stomach. The HOA was actually moving to take my house. Over that? A small fine? I just stood there staring at the paper, a mix of panic and confusion washing over me. I kept thinking, how the heck can something so minor turn into such a huge mess? I knew right then that something wasn't adding up, but I wasn't sure what move to make next. Up to that point, I'd always done my best to be a respectful neighbor. My yard was clean. My place was quiet. I kept to myself. But there was one person who always seemed to have a problem. Tamara. Yep, Tamara lived right next door. And she was the type who complained about everything. I'm talking the leaves rustling in the wind, a car door closing a little too loud. She always had something to whine about. She carried herself like she owned the whole block, always acting like every little thing was some personal offense. She came off as bossy and self-important, ready to raise hell over nothing. I tried to stay polite, keep my cool, and not let her get under my skin. I figured that staying calm and reasonable would eventually pay off, but man, I was about to find out that life doesn't always play fair. As I sat there that morning, staring at the foreclosure letter, all I could think about were the countless times Tamara had nitpicked and tattled on me for no good reason. I started to wonder, could she have influenced the HOA into thinking I was some kind of troublemaker? Was it possible that her constant complaints had pushed them into action? My brain was buzzing with questions. Did the HOA take her seriously? Could someone actually weaponize a minor fine just to screw someone over? That's when I realized I had to dig deeper. I hopped online and started researching everything. Property records, HOA rules, neighborhood maps, anything that might give me a clue. I wanted to understand exactly how this happened and why. I pored over documents, flipping through page after page of fine print and legal-sounding rules that supposedly kept our community in order. But the more I read, the more I saw how some rules could be twisted around to hurt people. That lit a fire in me. I had to get to the bottom of it. I started talking to a few folks around the neighborhood. Some were hesitant, but a few opened up. They mentioned how Tamara had a reputation for stirring the pot. Apparently, she loved showing up at HOA meetings and making a big scene, raising her voice, making people uncomfortable. I listened carefully and took notes, trying to piece it all together. Had she pulled stunts like this before? Was I just the latest target? The more I asked, the more it felt like I was pulling back the curtain on something bigger than I thought. It was like there was this hidden tension simmering beneath our quiet little neighborhood. And if I wanted to push back, I knew I had to be smart and gather every bit of info I could. So I sat at my kitchen table, surrounded by papers, diagrams, and notes. And for the first time in days, I felt a flicker of hope. I sketched out maps of the neighborhood, marked out Tamara's house, the HOA office, and dug into old meeting records. Every tiny detail felt like a puzzle piece falling into place. That's when I remembered something my dad used to say, never quit when the game feels rigged. What most folks didn't know is that my dad wasn't just any regular lawyer. He was the type who stood firm, even when the odds were stacked against him. I had that Danielle memory etched into my brain, him telling me to fight back when things weren't right. And suddenly, I started thinking, maybe I could lean on him if things got even worse. I also began documenting everything. Any time Tamara snapped at me, or shouted from her porch, I'd quietly hit record on my phone. I started keeping a journal, writing down every weird or shady thing she did, like the way she'd glare at me when I walked past, or how she'd loiter around the HOA office like she was waiting for something to blow up. It all seemed petty at first, but together it started painting a bigger picture. There was something off here. Tamara's constant drama and the HOA's sudden, over-the-top move to foreclose. They had to be connected somehow. But I still didn't have the full story. Not yet. All I knew was that this was no longer just about a fine. It wasn't even about a neighbor with a chip on her shoulder. This was turning into something much deeper, something personal. This wasn't just about a fine anymore. It was about something bigger: power, control, and the way people can use rules to push others around. One late afternoon, I headed down to the local library, hoping to dig up some old news, anything that could shine a light on Tamara or the HOA. There was something about the quiet hum of the computers and the smell of old books that gave me a strange kind of focus. Determined, I sat down and started typing keywords into the search bar, one after another. Bit by bit, stories started popping up on the screen. Some talked about unfair penalties and ridiculously strict HOA policies. One article really stuck with me. It told the story of how the HOA had made decisions in the past that actually hurt good, honest people. Folks who, like me, were just trying to live peacefully and follow the rules. I printed out every piece I thought might come in handy. By the time I walked out of there, I had a folder full of papers under my arm and a head swimming with questions. How the heck did a small $55 fine spiral into the threat of losing my home? Was this really about following the rules, or was something else happening behind closed doors? Later that evening, I sat on my couch and pulled the letter out again. I stared at it, trying to stay calm, but my thoughts were all over the place. I kept thinking about how I'd always tried to do the right thing, never causing any drama or trouble. Yet somehow, I was the one facing foreclosure. It felt surreal. I remember thinking, would anyone even care to hear my side of the story? As the sun dipped below the trees outside my window, I made myself a promise. I wouldn't back down without a fight. I'd use everything I'd learned, every bit of research I'd gathered, to stand up for myself and show that a small fine wasn't enough to take me down. Right then and there, even though I felt a little beat down, I also felt something else: determination. I realized that the next steps I took might be the most important ones of my life. I started forming a plan. I would show up to the next HOA meeting and demand answers. I thought about walking in with all my research, maps, articles, notes, spreading them out like evidence in a courtroom. I even considered reaching out to the local news. Maybe if enough people heard what was happening, the HOA wouldn't be able to ignore me. It felt like I was standing on the edge of something big, but I still had so many questions. How do I prove that I've been treated unfairly? Will anyone believe me? Or will Tamara's loud, dramatic presence drown out the truth? That night, as I got ready for bed, I couldn't stop replaying the whole thing in my head. I kept coming back to that letter. I held on to a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, this mess could still be fixed if I stayed calm, stuck to the facts, and refused to be pushed around. The thought of speaking up at that HOA meeting had my stomach in knots. But deep down, I knew that if I spoke clearly and kept my message simple, something even a fourth grader could understand, I might just get through to them. I practiced what I was going to say, choosing my words carefully, and promised myself one thing: fear would not keep me from telling my truth. The next morning, I got up early and went over my notes again. I studied the maps, reread the articles from the library, and reminded myself that each scrap of information was part of a bigger picture, one that showed how unfair this whole situation really was. I asked myself, am I ready to face the board? Ready to face Tamara? I wasn't sure. I felt small, going up against something that big and well organized. But I held tight to one belief. Truth and kindness still mattered. And if I stuck to those, maybe I had a shot. I packed up my papers, took one last look in the mirror, and headed out. Later that day, as I walked toward the HOA office, I saw her, Tamara, already standing by the entrance, arms crossed and eyes narrowed. The look she gave me? Cold as ice. I paused for a second, took a deep breath, and reminded myself why I was here. To stand up for my home, to speak honestly, and to demand some damn fairness. My research, my notes, my quiet determination, those were my weapons. And I believed that sometimes the quietest voice could still make the biggest impact if it spoke the truth. With my heart pounding in my chest, I stepped forward. I didn't know exactly what was waiting for me, but I knew I was done backing down. This little fine had blown up into something much bigger, and I had to believe someone out there would understand what was really going on. The meeting itself? Brief and totally confusing. Tamara's usual snide remarks filled the air like poison, but they only made me more fired up. When I got back home, I sat at my desk, spread out all my notes, and just stared for a minute. Yeah, the day had worn me down, but it also gave me something powerful. Purpose. I wasn't going to let this go. I'd keep digging, keep learning, and keep standing tall, no matter how long it took. Deep down, I could feel it. This was only the beginning of something much bigger. I had no idea how many hidden truths were about to come to light. Every step I took that day, every single question I asked, and every scrap of paper I tucked into my folder became part of a bigger mystery that I was dead set on solving. I made myself a promise right then. Nobody was going to take my home without a real fight. And I wasn't about to let Tamara's loudmouth or the HOA's rigid rules drown out my voice either. This journey had only just begun, and no matter how rough it got, I was in it for the long haul. The day the HOA hit me with that letter, saying my house was at risk over a $55 fine, I knew things were about to get messy. I sat there, staring at that old paper, feeling both anxious and determined. In that moment, I heard my dad's voice in my head, steady, kind, and strong, reminding me that every problem has a solution, as long as you stay calm, work hard, and don't give up. But I also knew Tamara wasn't going to sit back quietly. She was the type who needed to be right, and she had a real knack for making noise when she wanted her way. So I took myself back to the town library again and started diving into old property records and simple neighborhood maps. I scribbled notes in a worn notebook, drawing diagrams and using plain words that even a kid could follow. I needed to understand the rules inside and out. I needed to know if that fine had any real weight behind it, or if I'd just been caught in some petty power game. With every fact I uncovered, I started to feel a little stronger, a little more sure of myself. I came to realize that the HOA rules were supposed to protect the whole community, not just serve a handful of people who like to throw their weight around. It wasn't easy, but I kept at it, driven by the belief that the truth was on my side. Back home, my dad sat down beside me and started going over the documents. He explained everything slowly, in a calm, clear way, making sure I understood the law and how it was meant to protect people, not punish them unfairly. He told me how little things, like an unpaid $50 fee, could be twisted into something much bigger by folks who wanted control. His words gave me hope. With his help, I organized everything into a list of solid, undeniable facts. I laid it all out, how the fine grew out of proportion and how the whole process didn't seem right. It felt like I was assembling a case, one piece at a time, like putting together a puzzle where every corner mattered. The next day, I got ready for the big moment, my chance to speak at the HOA board meeting. My stomach was in knots, but I also felt this small flicker of excitement. This was my shot to set the record straight. I practiced my speech over and over in front of the mirror, focusing on keeping my voice steady and my message simple. I didn't want to stir up drama. I just wanted the truth to be heard. Just as I was about to head out, I opened the door and found Tamara standing there. She looked me up and down with that familiar judgmental glare, then said something snarky about how I should have figured this out by now. I was so wound up I almost snapped back. But I held it in, kept my head up, and walked past her without saying a word. Inside the meeting room, the board members sat with stiff faces. Some looked curious, others skeptical. I took a deep breath and started talking, walking them through what had happened and how a tiny fine had spiraled into a threat to my home. I laid out the maps, the records, everything I had gathered. I spoke slowly, making sure every word landed. For a few seconds, the room went quiet. I thought, maybe they're really listening. Then Tamara jumped in. She raised her voice and accused me of breaking the rules and disturbing the peace. She made it sound like I was some sort of neighborhood menace. I wanted to argue back right then and there, but I knew better. I stayed calm, waited for her to finish, and then went right back to my notes. I explained exactly what I'd learned, how the fine didn't match the punishment, and how the board's response was way out of line. I kept it all grounded in facts, showing them that this wasn't about rebellion. It was about fairness. Some of the board members looked at each other. A few even gave small nods, like they were starting to get it. That gave me a little boost of hope. After the meeting, I made sure to save a voice recording of the whole thing on my phone, just in case. I figured it might come in handy later. That evening, I put together a short video clip and posted it on social media. I kept my words simple and honest, explaining what had happened and how I was fighting back. To my surprise, the video started picking up steam. People from the neighborhood began reaching out, some just to say they were shocked, others to tell me they'd been through something similar. Messages of support started flooding in, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel alone in this. People started asking the Daniele thing I'd been wondering all along. How could something as minor as a $55 fine cause this much trouble? Was it really fair to treat someone this way over such a small issue? Their questions, their concern, it gave me strength I didn't know I needed. That's when it hit me. Our quiet little neighborhood was starting to wake up. Folks were beginning to see the bigger picture. Even with Tamara yelling louder and trying to stay in control, her voice wasn't the only one being heard anymore. As the days turned into weeks, my dad and I kept building the case. We stayed up late, going over every detail. Along the way, we connected with a few kind-hearted neighbors who'd also had run-ins with the HOA. They shared their stories, and just like mine, they were full of confusion, frustration, and a sense that something wasn't right. One of the neighbors, a guy named Daniel, offered to help us print up some flyers. He was the friendly, roll-up-his-sleeves type, always ready to lend a hand. Together, we made the flyers easy to read, big, bold letters, plain language, and simple facts. We wanted to make sure anyone, even a fourth grader, could understand what was going on in our community. The flyers broke down the rules and showed how a small error had spiraled into something unfair and completely avoidable. It felt good. It felt right, like we were finally shining a light on the truth. But while we were busy spreading facts, Tamara was growing more aggressive. She started sending me nasty letters, handwritten, filled with harsh words and accusations. A couple of times, I caught her lurking near my front yard, just staring at the house with a sour look on her face. You could tell she was feeling the pressure. Her grip on the neighborhood was slipping, and she didn't like it one bit. Still, I stayed calm. I didn't let her words rattle me. I stuck to the truth and let the facts do the talking. I believed, deep down, that the truth always speaks louder than anger, especially when you stay patient. I remember one evening clearly. I was sitting with my dad, surrounded by notes and flyers, reading Tamara's letters out loud. The room was quiet except for the soft tick of the wall clock. We went over every document again, every map, every line in the HOA rules. That's when my dad spotted something. He pointed to a small error in the HOA's old record, a date that didn't line up, a note that didn't match. He explained to me that even the folks in charge can make mistakes, and if they could mess things up, then maybe that $55 fine wasn't as rock solid as they claimed. It was just a small detail, but it felt like a spark in the dark. I was proud of all the work we'd done, but I couldn't lie. I was nervous too. Tamara was unpredictable, and I had no idea what she might try next. But thinking about the neighbors who'd come forward kept me going. Their courage reminded me I wasn't alone. Then, one morning, something big happened. I got a call from a local news reporter who'd seen my video online. She said she wanted to meet and hear my story in person. My heart started pounding. I was excited, but nervous too. This was my shot to take the truth beyond just our street. We met later that day, and I laid everything out for her. I kept it honest, plain, and real, just like I had for the board. I talked about the fine, the threat of foreclosure, the rules I'd studied, and the maps I'd drawn. She listened closely, nodding as I spoke, and I could tell she really understood what I was saying. I hoped that once her story hit the airwaves, more people would see how something so small could turn a person's life upside down. With each step forward, I felt like I was building a bridge, one that stretched from the truth to the people who needed to hear it. This fight wasn't just about me anymore. It was about every neighbor who'd been silenced, every family who'd been confused or pushed around by a system that was supposed to protect them. I wasn't just that quiet guy anymore. I had found my voice. I'd used facts, research, maps, and even social media to push back. And I was proving that no one should lose their home over a petty fine, not without a fair shot to defend themselves. That night I sat at my desk again. My notes were stacked neatly. The flyers were ready to go. I looked around and realized the battle was still going. We weren't done yet, not even close. But I felt ready. I wanted to keep digging, keep asking questions, and be prepared for whatever came next. Who knew what Tamara might try, or what tricks the HOA could still have up their sleeve? I took a deep breath and looked out the window at our little street. Quiet houses, sleeping neighbors, each with their own story. And I made myself another promise right then. No matter what came next, I'd keep standing up for what was right. I'd keep chasing the truth, no matter how long it took. Because I had learned something important. Even the smallest action can lead to big change. And as I turned off the lamp that night, with the room dim and still, I felt two things at once: the heavy weight of responsibility and the bright, steady light of hope. I stood in my living room, heart thudding in my chest, knowing that what I did next could change everything. My home, my peace, was still hanging in the balance. The HOA's unfair threats and Tamara's constant nonsense had pushed me to the edge. But I wasn't about to break. I reminded myself, stay calm, stay sharp. I had done the work. I'd studied property lines, learned the rules, talked to legal experts, and even spoken to the press. I was more prepared than I'd ever been. I wasn't going to let Tamara's drama or the HOA's heavy-handed tactics win this fight. My dad's guidance had been my anchor. We'd spent hours together combing through old property maps and digging into legal paperwork that clearly showed my home wasn't in violation of anything. Every single page we reviewed gave me a little more confidence. Each document was another piece of evidence proving what I'd known all along. I was in the right. I still remember the moment I found that old map at the town library. It showed my exact property lines, and it lined up perfectly with my case. That map felt like gold. Like I'd just stumbled on the one thing that could turn everything around. And it did. That discovery gave me a second wind. It reminded me that truth always leaves a trail. A few days later, I found myself in another meeting with the HOA board. The room felt tight with tension. Tamara was already there, sitting up front with that smug expression she wore like a badge of honor. She spoke in her usual loud, pushy way, throwing out claims and trying to dominate the room. But I kept my cool. I didn't interrupt. I just listened, took notes, and waited for my turn. When I finally spoke, I laid out my questions with calm confidence. I referred to specific property lines, HOA rule numbers, and errors in their own paperwork. I saw the surprise flash across a few board members' faces. They hadn't expected me to come in with real facts. That moment gave me a shot of quiet pride. I knew I'd caught them off guard. Not long after, I invited a local reporter back to go over the documents and maps in person. I wanted the public to see that this wasn't just about me, it was about fairness. About standing up when something isn't right. I explained how the fine had snowballed into this ridiculous mess, and how Tamara's constant harassment had added fuel to the fire. Even when I talked about Tamara, I kept my voice steady. No insults, no yelling, just truth. Her entitled attitude had stirred up so much unnecessary drama, and the HOA had let it spiral out of control. And now, finally, someone was paying attention. Thanks to the news story, more people started questioning the HOA. Neighbors who had stayed silent before were now speaking up. It felt like the first domino had fallen, and I wasn't alone anymore. My dad and I kept working late into the nights. We built a case that was clear, logical, and easy to follow. So simple, even a kid could have understood it. The evidence was solid. Every map, every document, every photo and letter, it all came together like bricks in a wall that now stood strong between me and the people trying to take my home. I remember one night, sitting at the kitchen table with papers spread out in front of me. The house was quiet. The only sound was the faint ticking of the clock. I felt this strange mix of fear and hope, knowing we were close to the final showdown. My story had slowly made its way through the neighborhood, and I could see it in the way people looked at me. Some nodded as I walked by. Some stopped to quietly say, "We're with you." Then came the day I'd been preparing for the final decision. I walked into the courtroom with my shoulders squared and my thoughts clear. I wasn't angry. I wasn't afraid. I just knew the truth, and I was ready to speak it. I calmly laid out the evidence, starting with the maps, moving through the HOA's own flawed records, and even quoting parts of the news segment that had aired. No drama. Just facts, delivered plainly. The judge listened closely. I could feel how much weight my words carried, not just in my voice, but in my heart. Every sentence I spoke held a piece of what I'd been through, the weight of that fight, the pressure, the late nights, the doubts. I felt all of it in that room. And then came the decision. The judge ruled in my favor. In that moment, the relief hit me like a wave. I was overwhelmed by this sense of pride, not the kind that makes you puff up your chest, but the kind that settles deep in your bones. I'd done it. I had stood up for myself. I had protected my home, not with anger or noise, but with truth, patience, and the steady help of my dad. But as I walked out of the courtroom, part of me was already wondering, what now? What would Tamara do now that her claims had been shut down? Would she back off, or would she dig in deeper, looking for a new way to cause trouble? I didn't know. But I did know this. Winning this case was just one chapter. There was still work to be done. This fight had never been about just one house. It was about fairness in our whole neighborhood. And now that the truth was out there, I was ready to keep going, no matter where the next twist took me.